Good morning. So are you ready? Yeah, you're ready. And I didn't get it. That was not, are you ready for Christmas is the question, right? Are you ready for Christmas, right? Yeah, you guys are ready down here, down front. It's good to see you guys in spitting distance this morning. Good. Look out. All right. This morning, we've been talking about the sermon series about Do Not Be Afraid. These messengers, these angels keep bringing these messages to people in the nativity event. And the messages always start off with the words, do not be afraid. So in our day, we don't really think of Christmas as something to fear, do we? I mean, we don't think of this as a fearful time in our lives. Yet for the first century and the things that were going on in these events, it was fearful. But, I thought, well, maybe we're afraid of something, right? So I did a little research, and I went to psychologytoday.com, and I found some disorders and phobias that I want to share with you this morning that happen around Christmas. So maybe you have some of these disorders yourself. The first one is OOPD, which is online ordering personality disorder. This is that disorder where you've got to be at work all day and you've got the internet on, you still got the browser up in your computer and you click it down when your boss comes in and you're constantly checking your eBay auction site or you're checking your Amazon order, you're checking where you're going to get the best deal online and you're obsessed about it and so you're checking it all the time. Do we have anybody with OOPD in here that needs to make a confession? All right. Maybe you have what my children have, that's CCC, which is calendar countdown condition. If you walk into my house, you will get the exact number of days left till Christmas. How many days are left? How many days are left till Christmas? Like 20. Is that right? Does that sound right? It does right. See, I knew there was someone else with CCC in this building. We have that, and then there's OCD AAA. Does anybody have OCD AAA? OCD AAA, there you go. AAA, which is this fear that overcomes you on Christmas morning when your kids are opening their new electronic toys and you have forgotten to get the batteries. And so you go into panic mode. I have actually experienced, anybody else experienced that? And then, of course, there's agoraphobia, and that's the fear of getting another sweater from Aunt Mabel this Christmas. So we have multiple fears, things to be afraid of at Christmas, don't we? But Zechariah and many of the folks that will be looking at these messages, there was something to be afraid of. There was a lot going on when Jesus was born that created fear for people. Now, Zechariah was one of 18,000 priests that served in the temple. And he served 2 weeks out of the year, 2 different weeks out of the year. And it was this particular time that the lot fell to him to go and present the offering of incense on the altar of the Lord. Now, this was a very high privilege for a priest. In fact, he may never have done this before, and he may never do it again, but the lot fell to him to go to the altar and place the incense there. And I don't know about you, but as he was going up there to the altar and placing the incense on it, he didn't expect anybody to be there. Have you ever had that experience of walking into a house that you expected to be empty, only to turn a corner and find somebody standing there? Or maybe you even have somebody in your house that jumps out at you from time to time to let you know that they're there, that scares you. Well, Zechariah is overcome with fear. He is startled because as he's walking up to the altar, there appears an angel of the Lord beside the altar. He didn't expect anyone to be there, and here is this messenger. And these words come to Zechariah, do not be afraid. Now, first of all, Zechariah is afraid because, if you see an angel standing by an altar, I think we'd be a little bit scared. But I think there's some other things going on in here in this text, and there's some other things going on in Zechariah's heart that has him afraid. Think about it. This message is not just good news. It's, you guys are going to have a kid. You're going to have a child. I love how Zechariah puts it. You can tell Zechariah has been married for a while because he says, I'm an old man, But my wife, she's getting along in years. He doesn't say old woman. You see, he said, she's getting along in years. Very diplomatic way of putting it. You can tell he's been married a while. But Elizabeth and Zechariah are well along in their years. And how many times have they experienced the failure of being a parent? How many times have they hoped to be a parent and not experienced that hope? How many times have they experienced that disappointment and now they've maybe even they've gotten to the point where they've given up, they've resigned themselves. They've given up on that idea of ever being parents. It's interesting because Elizabeth words it that it's the disgrace of the people. It's the people around her who have caused disgrace. But in God's eyes, this is not some punishment or some disgrace that God has for them. In fact, God sees them as very upright and upstanding and righteous people that serve God. That had nothing to do with their standing before God. But as a parent, it's someone who's not experienced parenthood, who's experienced what would maybe be perceived as failure time and time again, there can become a fear of failure. Sometimes we fear failure. We're fear, or we resign ourselves to it, and we give up. And really, that's what failure is. It's giving up. Failure is just giving up. It's not making the mistake. It's not doing something wrong. It's giving up on it. It's resigning from ever trying to change or ever trying to hope again. That's maybe failure. So Zechariah's fear of failure is going on here. Now, what's the flip side to fear? What's the opposite of fear? It's faith, isn't it? Faith is the flip side of the coin. Fear on one side, faith on the other. Faith says, I'm going to hope for something even though I'm not sure it's going to happen. Being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see is faith. Faith is trusting in something even though we're not sure about it. You know, Boeing, I apologize for all the Northrop Grumman people in the room here this morning for this analogy, but Boeing created the 707 in 1958, the first commercial jetliner to fly on jets and to go out there into public service. And so they had engineered this great Boeing 707 that was now flying people around the country and around the world. And on one particular flight, there was two passengers sitting next to each other, and they were on a prop flight. You know, they were on with you remember the old kind with the propellers? Anybody ever had to ride on one of those? And it's amazing, we don't want to ride on those anymore, but back in 1958, everybody wanted to ride on those because they felt safe. And so they're on this prop plane, and the two passengers were talking to one another. It turns out that one of the passengers was an engineer on the Boeing 707. And so they began to strike up a conversation, and the engineer began to explain how great the 707 was, how they had designed the engine so well, how they had put it through extensive testing time and time again, and how it was so ready to be put to use in the commercial market. And so the natural question came up in the course of the conversation. The passenger asked the engineer, "So have you flown on the 707? And the engineer says, "I think I'm going to wait a while." You see, there's a difference between believing something is going to be true and trusting it to be true. There's a difference between believing and knowing, and having faith in something and trusting something. If he had had faith, if he had really believed what he had said about that jetliner, the question is, why are you not trusting to get on it, to fly on it? That would be an act of faith. Even though it hadn't been tried and tested, it's the faith, it's the trust that gets you on the plane. I think about that sometimes. We often fear that we might be wrong, that we might not be right, that we're not 100% certain that something might fail. But it's that fear that keeps us from experiencing faith. The other thing that's going on with Zechariah is I think he's afraid of being wrong. I don't know about you, but have you ever been afraid of being wrong? Of not being right? Because Zechariah's question to the messenger, to the angel is, how will I know intellectually that this is going to be so? How will I know? I want to know. I want you to give me 100% proof that this is going to happen, because I've gone through this before. I know how babies come into the world, and I know that we are well along in our years. So I want to know 100% sure. Anybody ever ask that question? We always want to know 100% for sure that we're going to be right, that we sometimes fear being wrong. John Holliday was the editor of the Indianapolis News. Indianapolis News. Did I say that right? And he was the chief editor, and one day it came to his desk that there was a misprint in the latest edition of the newspaper. And someone had misspelled the word height, H-E-I-G-H-T, and spelled it H-I-G-H-T. And so he ran down to the floor to demand where this error had occurred and who was responsible for this error in the newspaper. And so everybody scurried around to find out who to blame. And it came down to discover that it was John Holliday, the chief editor himself, who had made the mistake. And so when they confronted him with his mistake, he said, "Well, if that's the way I wrote it, it must be right." And do you know, for the next 30 years, that newspaper printed that word H-I-G-H-T because someone was afraid to be wrong. I am going to give you a little tip today that will save your career or your marriage. You want to hear it? You ready? Practice this phrase. Here's the phrase: I could be wrong. I could be wrong. Let's practice that this morning, by the way. Let's do that. Repeat after me. I could be wrong. You know, we could be wrong about some things. We could be wrong about some things about God. We could be wrong about some things about this story. We could be wrong because we so much want to know 100% for sure. But when we just rely on that certainty, that 100% assurance, we'll have no reason for faith. There's no room for faith. And it's actually, Zechariah is, I don't think, being punished by his speechlessness. I think Zechariah is being humbled by his speechlessness. Because humility is the doorway to faith. You see, it's when I need to be right, when I can't swallow my pride, when I have to have it all 100%, that I am not humble enough to open the door to faith in my life. And God so desperately wants us to be in that place of just trusting God. Being in that place of faith. Trusting that everything's going to work out okay. You know, just like Zechariah, even priests can lack faith. And I remember when I was a little guy, about 9 or 10 years of age, my dad would take me on these outdoor education programs. He ran an outdoor education program with high school students, and one particular summer I got to tag along on all these cool trips, and we were spelunking this day. We were in a cave in West Virginia. And as we went into the cave, I thought this was cool. You know, you get the hat on with the light. You know, all 10-year-old boys love that. And so we're exploring this cave, and we're scurrying all over this cave. And we got to a point in the cave, and my dad was all along saying to me, you know, when we get deep into this cave, Matt, you're going to see the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. There is this awesome waterfall inside this cave. And so I was so looking forward to getting to that waterfall, to getting to that place that my dad had described for me. But we came into our path. We came to a place in the cave as we were exploring that there was a crevasse. And I remember looking as a child, as a 10-year-old boy, into that crevasse and shining my light down the crevasse, and I could not see the bottom. My light would not reach the bottom. It was a bottomless pit in my mind. And I looked at the gap from one side of that crevasse to the other side of that crevasse, and it looked pretty big to me. And all the teenagers, they're running and jumping across and running and jumping across, because when you're a teenager, you think, you know, nothing's ever going to happen to you. But as a 10-year-old boy, you're not quite there yet. So I remember standing, and everybody had made it across, including my father. He had jumped across, and I was like, I'm not going across there. I just kept looking down at the darkness. And Dad beckoned me to come across. He said, you can make it. It's okay. Come over. It'll be all right. And I said, no, I'm not going across. So finally my dad came over to the crevasse. He grabbed the rock and he stepped across the crevasse and he straddled the crevasse. So you can see how wide it really was. And he straddled it and he held out his hands and he says, just grab hold of me and I'll get you across. And I'm sorry to say to you that I didn't do that. Because I kept looking at the darkness and fearing. And so I ended up walking out of the cave, never having seen what was in the bottom of that cave with my dad. All because of a simple thing. Because I got so consumed with the darkness and so focused on the darkness that I didn't look to my dad and trust my dad. Had I trusted my dad, everything would have been just fine. But that's the difference between fear and faith. Fear is when we get consumed with the darkness, when we get so focused on the dark places, the failures, the shame, the disgrace, whatever it is, whatever our darkness is. And God is standing there in the gap for us and saying, just trust me. You're not going to be 100% sure. But if you trust me, I'll get you there. I'll get you to that place that I have for you, that I've described for you. If you'll just trust me. See, even young priests can underestimate the power of God. I hope that you don't. Amen.